Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Asan Institute. Thank you for coming at such early time today. As you know, we have a very special guest, Dr. Ian Bremmer from the Eurasia Group. He will be giving us Asan special lecture today. Before we begin, I would like to welcome Dr. Ham Chae-bong, the president of the Asan Institute, to the stage for welcome remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Asan Institute. Great to have you all here today. We have Dr. Ian Bremmer here, as Eileen just introduced. As you know, he's the founder and president of the Eurasia Group. And it's always, as a political scientist, as a fellow political scientist, it's always a wonder. You never figured that you could turn political science into a profitable anything. But somehow, Dr. Bremmer has really found a way, and I think it really has been a stroke of genius to use political science to assess political risk that could be used by investors with lots of money. I think, why didn't somebody else think of it before? I'm sure some have, but he's the one who has actually put it together and came up with theories, came up with indices that actually link the two worlds in the most effective way that anybody has ever found to date. And his books, J-Curve, and the most recent one, the G0 world. Every book that he publishes has been has really, exactly on the mark. He reads the pulse of the global political, financial world changing constantly, but he's always on the mark, and it's really a tribute to whatever formula he came up with. It's a great pleasure to have him here, and he's talking about, he'll be talking today about how is geopolitics impacting markets today. It's an issue that we are truly grappling with in this part of the region of the world. This region of the world. I think until about 2 years ago, we were saying that our region has been the most successful in avoiding the global financial crisis, and our economies are roaring, but now we're suddenly finding ourselves in this, what can only be termed return to history. Things that you would never have guessed are popping up, to beginning to raise tensions among neighbors, that in terms of economic interdependence, we've been closer than anything we've ever experienced before. So are we then entering a new era where politics and these other issues are beginning to seriously disrupt the beautiful economic machine we thought we had built up for ourselves in this part of the region? And of course, the continuing threat from North Korea. How is that combining with all these other political risks that we hadn't really factored in, to create a very new and volatile situation that we haven't quite come to grasp with, and we haven't been able to quite come up with the right strategy, setting aside financial strategy, but also even national security strategy is being profoundly affected by these changes. And so I'm very happy to have Dr. Ian Bremmer here with us to give us an overview of where he thinks all these factors, how they are interacting, and how he thinks this might be affecting our region of the world. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ian Bremmer.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I guess I should start. First of all, it's great to be introduced by a fellow political scientist. It's nice to be in a room of folks that are sort of like-minded on what we think and value in the world. I did not set out to start this company. at all. It's funny. I'll give you a little background just because of who you guys are. When I started my PhD, I was very young. I got my PhD. I was 24, and I had no intent. The reason I got a PhD was not to become an academic. I got a PhD because I really liked political science. I read The Economist when I was younger. I played Risk, right? I mean, all that stuff that one does when one has no girlfriends and is too dorky. And I liked reading about the world. And in college, I had a chance to travel to some very interesting places. I went to the former Soviet Union on several occasions. I went to England for a year. I went to Japan. So, I mean, in this time, 85 to 89, kind of exciting, especially Moscow, Gorbachev, Perestroika, Glasnost, all that stuff. Exciting times. Who knew that Ukraine was going to be so interesting again, right? Who knew? My old stomping ground. So anyway, my interest in getting a PhD was just I was so young, I figured, well, I'll get the degree, and then when I finish, then I'll go and get a real job. And when I finished the PhD, everyone said, okay, Ian, well, now you can be an academic or you can go do policy. I'm like, no, I want to get a job. And they said, well, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean get a job? I said, work in a business, work in a company, in the real world. I said, it's clear that political science is very relevant to the real world. Growth of emerging markets, energy and commodity coming from unstable places, big tectonic geopolitical shifts coming, end of the Cold War. It's very clear that political scientists should have something to say to the markets. I'm like, no. If you get a PhD, you don't go into business. That seemed crazy to me. So I moved to New York, and I met with all of these people in businesses and senior bankers. I remember who they were. Bob Hormats, who then became Undersecretary of State. He was at Goldman Sachs at the time. Frank Wisner, who had been ambassador to India, many other countries, was at AIG at the time. Teddy Roosevelt IV, who was the great-grandson of Teddy Roosevelt I. At Lehman Brothers, and these people, they took me to wonderful lunches, and they were talking to me about the stuff I was doing. They were very interested, and then I said, okay, well, you should give me a job to be a political scientist in your company. And they said, there's only one problem. What? We don't hire political scientists. What do you mean? You hire economists, you hire strategists, you even hire physicists to do derivatives modeling and chaos theory. Clearly, you must hire political scientists. No, we don't. Okay. So this is now 1996, and I am getting frustrated because I got my PhD, and I'm covering a part of the world that is in the news and relevant. People want to invest there. Nobody wants to hire me. And finally, after a year of getting frustrated, I went to one of those people that had been taking me for lunch. I don't remember which one. And I said, well, if you're not going to hire me, but you want to have lunch, you're spending all this time, it clearly is worth something to you. If I were to hang out a shingle, start my own thing, would you become a client? And he said, sure. And I thought to myself, I really should have thought about this a year ago. And within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I probably had 10 clients. I didn't have a business. I didn't have a business plan. And then it grew. And I've grown it for 16 years now. We now have 150 full-time people. We have 400 clients all over the world. It's a real business. It's very exciting. And suddenly I'm ostensibly a businessman. But I'm not a businessman. I have a CEO. I'm a political scientist. I still do what I always did. Just now we actually have a firm. And other people have created firms, and political risk is becoming an industry. It's becoming an industry. Thank God. I mean, if I've accomplished one good thing, it's giving political scientists another place to go and do stuff for a living. Because everyone loves the idea of political science as a degree, but the number of people that I would tell, oh, I'm a political scientist, like, oh yeah, I graduated in political science when I was an undergraduate. What do you do now? Oh, I sell insurance. You know? I know, I want them to say, I'm a political scientist. When I come into your country, I come to Seoul, and it says on the customs form, occupation, I write political scientist. I'm very proud of that, right? Don't be ashamed that you're a political scientist, okay? Don't have an anonymous program. Don't do that. Embrace your inner nerd. It's very important, as I do. So that's some background, which is not what I was planning on talking about today, but you brought it out in me by saying, why is it that I started this company? We should all make money. So geopolitics in the markets today. This is a good time to be a political scientist. 2008 to 2013 were years where economic risk was really driving the big questions for everyone, right? The Eurozone implosion, the financial crisis, the double-dip recession possibilities in the US, the debt limit crisis, all this stuff. And the fact is that the politics were relatively stabilizing, but the economics were concerning everyone. I remember, if you guys read The Economist, how many people read The Economist? Good, because here you should read The Economist. 2 years ago, I counted there were at least 7 covers of The Economist that showed the euro exploding. Falling off a cliff, bursting into flames, breaking apart, whatever it was. Now, that's because The Economist is from Britain and they hate the Eurozone, so it's bias. But nonetheless, that was the concern. If you went to Davos that year, everyone was saying, oh my God, the Eurozone's going to collapse. And it turned out, of course, that the politics were pretty bad in Europe, but they weren't that bad. You're concerned about the United States, you're concerned about the debt limit crisis, you're concerned about the impact of the government shutdown. Congress is very dysfunctional in the US. I'm not going to defend Congress. You don't do that. But it's not that dysfunctional, right? I mean, they're not going to shoot themselves in the feet. They're going to pretend. They're going to tell everyone, I got a gun. This is my foot. It's on the trigger. But they're not going to do it, right? They just act stupid. But they weren't going to actually move to a serious situation where the United States was suddenly not going to pay off its debt, stuff like that. It wasn't going to happen. So the politics were relatively stabilized and the economics were much more problematic. Now we are in 2014. Enter the political scientists, right? Because the economics now look better. The Eurozone is out of recession. It's not exactly exhilarating growth, but we're less worried. The United States is actually in rebound and recovery. Not for everyone in America, let's be clear, but you want to talk about the macroeconomics in the US, people are betting big on the US economy. Abenomics in Japan, who's worried about a Chinese hard landing? The macroeconomic issues actually look a lot better. What looks worse? We look worse. The political scientists look worse. The geopolitics, ruining your economic machine in South Korea. I mean, there are places where the geopolitics are worse than Asia for now. The Middle East, certainly. Ukraine, for example. But I'm not sure that's really good, because all that does is help to distract the Americans from paying attention to the issue that really matters with just China and everything around China. That's bigger than everything else by a factor of 5, 10? I don't know. It's not a factor of 2. I mean, people ask me, what's the biggest geopolitical risk in the world? I say, what, today or long term? Like long term? 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? There's only one question. That's it. It's China. There's a lot of stuff around China. China, Japan, China, South Korea, North Korea, China, US, China resources, China, Africa, China, does it work? Do they restructure? China, political reform, economic reform, state capitalism, cyber, climate, demographics, food. I don't know, pick one of 30, right? But they all involve China. They all involve China. And that is an enormous driver. The beautiful thing, if you think that geopolitics matters in 2014, not even close to the way it's going to matter when China becomes the world's largest economy, right? Because when China becomes the world's largest economy, it will still be poor. When China becomes the world's largest economy, it will still be authoritarian. It will still be state capitalist. In other words, it will still fundamentally disagree with the United States and America's allies on things involving priorities, values, leadership, international structure, and that is not going to be easy. It's particularly not going to be easy because the Americans don't like looking at things from other people's perspective. I mean, if America was Canada, this would be easier, right? It's not. America's not Canada. We can't stand considering the world from other people's perspectives. Ukraine has been a great example of this. I should spend some time talking about Ukraine, right? We all care. I was on the treadmill this morning, I saw CNN and here in Asia talking about Ukraine. Like, I had no idea that you would care about Ukraine in Asia. The markets went down in Asia on Ukraine. Who knew that Ukraine could affect your markets? Political scientists did, right? We kind of knew, right? Like, yeah, that's not going to work. This is not going to work. That country's not going to work. So Ukraine is a situation where the United States has really overextended itself. And they've not recognized that they've overextended themselves, right? I mean, after Chechnya, Ukraine is by far the most important national security interest that Russia has. Russia's not a big growing power. Russia is a declining power. You want to know who Russia's allies are right now? How about Armenia, Belarus, and Tajikistan? Anyone want to bet on that coalition? Right? Maybe Syria, if Syria were a country. And it's kind of not. But if it were, it would be an ally of Russia too. This is not a country that's about to engage in Cold War with the U.S. This is a country that is losing. It's losing badly. Brain drain, massive corruption, capital flight, $51 billion on Sochi spent on what? You tell me, right? And political institutions that have been decimated by Putin over the last years. And then the Americans tell Russia, actually, the one thing that keeps you feeling like an empire, sorry. Yeah, we cut a deal between the president and the opposition, but the opposition decided they didn't want to stick with that deal, so tough luck. You think the Russians are going to accept that? You got to be kidding me. And the Americans tell the Russians, no, you don't you dare go in. There will be consequences. What kind of consequences? We haven't figured that out yet. Let me tell you something. You're going to threaten people with consequences? Think about what the consequences are before you say that. Just consider what it might be. So we initially said, Kerry came out and said, we might not go to Sochi for the G8. And Putin's saying, oh my God, they might not come to Sochi for the G8. Might kick them out of the G8. Horrifying, right? There might be visa restrictions. There is absolutely nothing that the West could credibly do that remotely comes close to the level of interest that Putin has in Ukraine. And now, several days into this crisis, you would think that the Americans would understand how badly they've miscalculated. They do not. They do not. This is not a priority for the United States. Foreign policy, in general, is not a priority for this administration. There are lots of reasons for that. We can talk about it. Some of them are perfectly legitimate reasons. Some of them somewhat less so. Some of them are somewhat short-sighted. Some of them are purely political. It doesn't matter. It's not as if it would be radically different under Romney, frankly, if I'm being really honest about it. It's not a Democrat versus Republican thing. This is structural. The G0 is structural, right? But the point is, we are now looking at Russia in Crimea, the United States in a situation where we must put sanctions of some form on Russia, or we're going to be seen as having absolutely zero credibility on this issue. And after we do so, Russia will respond with no flexibility whatsoever. The only way out of this crisis is to try to get someone, probably the Germans, to back down and cut a deal that allow the Russians to effectively keep Crimea and stop them there. That's a horrible situation, right? That's one that nobody wanted to be in, but it's one because people didn't think about life from the perspective of the other country. This is why China becoming the world's largest economy matters so much, because the United States doesn't need to care about what other countries think as long as the U.S. is biggest by a large margin, right? I mean, globalization coming out of World War II was not globalization. It was the United States. The U.S. created these institutions. The IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods Accord, the World Trade Organization. Those organizations sound global, right? The World Trade Organization sounds global. World Bank sounds global. World Series sounds global, right? Does. Baseball, global. We got a Canadian team, it's global, right? the World Bank is not global. The World Bank is American. The United States set up the World Bank to support American domestic and democratic agenda, American values, American priorities, American allies, right? That's how we set these institutions up. And we built them, and it created a lot of wealth. And it helped make the world, help bring the world out of decimation in World War II, rebuilt Japan, rebuilt Europe. I'm not saying these were bad things, but don't pretend they were global. They were American, right? And for decades, the United States has presumed that America's way of doing things is just the way everyone else is going to do it. Now, we're now in a world where you've got emerging markets that don't actually agree with the way Western rules and globalization have been set up. You know, the United States looks at a company like Google and they tell the Chinese, you got to let Google in because it's a multinational corporation. You got to support that rule of law, well for everybody. China looks at Google and they say, wait a second, you want us to let in a company that's going to collect data on all of our citizens and then give it to the NSA? Are you crazy? Why would we want to do that? I mean, if I were advising the Chinese leadership as a political scientist, I would tell them to keep Google out, okay? I might tell them to keep a little bit of Google so that dissidents could have Gmail that I would be able to monitor so that I could effectively crush dissidents. I might do that. But I would not want Google to like open up shop in China or Facebook or Twitter, right? Or competitors to Huawei. I would not want that. What is the willingness of the average American in government to think about this from the Chinese perspective? It's zero, right? I had a wonderful debate against Tony Blair about 4 years ago. It was just as the G20, just as it was becoming obvious that the G20 was going to be ineffectual, coming out of the financial crisis, because the first couple meetings, they all were so focused on the crisis, they all said, oh, no, we got to fix this, got to fix this. As soon as you're getting out of the crisis, G20 said, okay, now we're going our own way. And Blair was worried about that, and so he started by saying, we've got to step up. The Americans and the Brits must provide leadership in the G20. We have to make sure the G20 works. And I said, okay, I get it, that's great. So let me ask you, given that in the G20 you have countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia and China, countries that actually have fundamentally different perspectives on rule of law and democratic institutions and free markets and all of these things, which of our values do you believe that we will need to be willing to compromise on, have dialogue on, so that we could more effectively have cohesion and leadership in this G20? I asked him that. And God bless Tony Blair. Tony Blair thinks about it. He said, that's a very good question. It's a difficult question. He says, but ultimately, I wouldn't change any of our values. I wouldn't compromise on any of our values because they're the right values. And these people, these countries really recognize that ultimately, that these are the right values. And I said, Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, I said, I'm very impressed that you answered me that way because it's an honest answer. And if Obama were to answer me and answer me honestly, I think he'd say the same thing. If Romney were to answer, he'd say the same thing. The only problem is that guarantees the G20 won't work. Right? It guarantees it. Maybe we'll finally throw Russia out of the G8. It's not going to fix Ukraine, but it will make the G7 more functional. Right? I mean, in a world where when US-led global institutions no longer function, you have two choices. You can still do global and have no leadership, like the Security Council and the G20, or you can have leadership but not be global. You can choose, right? So on climate, we do global but no leadership. So we have these big global summits. We go to, Copenhagen, and we go to Durban, and we go to Cancun, and we all get together, and we say we got to do something, and nobody does something, and we all blame each other, which is immoral. It's immoral. It's immoral to continue to do global and as your primary thing and think that is going to fix the problem. You should just stop them. We should end the global summits. That would actually be better for climate at this point. I mean, I'd rather have global summits where people talk, but that's not a big deal. But at this point, they're so broken, we should probably stop. I was actually teaching at my university the other day, and I asked my students, I said, look, how many more climate summits, global climate summits, do we need to have before we realize that we should stop having global climate summits? And one of my students raised his hand, and I picked on him, and he said 7. I said 7? Why 7? He said, well, because 2 or 3 is probably not enough, but by the time you get to 10, it's going to be completely done. So, I mean, you got 7 sounds. Okay, 7. Let's say 7. Can I count down? We're almost there. Now we can stop doing it. But trade, this is what we're doing, right? I mean, we've got Doha. We know Doha's dead. Instead, we're doing TPP. We're doing TTIP. Why are we doing that? Well, because we just can't get a larger group together to agree at this point in more durable, deeper economic integration. But TPP we can do. We can get like-minded countries to come together, 40% of the world's GDP. It's not 90%. It's not 100. It's not great. In a G0 world, you're not getting great. I like great, but as a political scientist, I'm not allowed to like great. I'm only allowed to write about where we are. The G0 is that way. Syria is not great. Ukraine is not great, but it is not surprising. Not in a G0. Right? So talked a little bit about Ukraine, and what I think needs to happen there. This year, one of the places where geopolitics is going to drive massive instability is the emerging markets writ large. Emerging markets are countries where politics matter at least as much as economics to market outcomes. They're places where elections are usually problematic, and they're usually problematic because you need to have continued improved governance for people to actually want to continue to invest more and more in emerging markets, especially as middle classes are growing and demand more from their countries. You know how many emerging markets are having elections this year? 44. Not seen that since 2008, right? That causes more risk. And generally speaking, right now, a lot of emerging markets are badly governed. Turkey, Argentina, Russia, Venezuela, India, Thailand. I keep going. Right? I mean, as you look around the big emerging markets, leave aside China, which really isn't an emerging market anymore. It's bigger than all the other BRICS combined. It's a macro driver. It's just different. It's a beast all to itself out there, right? But you look at the rest of the emerging markets in the world, most are badly governed. This isn't about the taper. This isn't about worry about China growth. This is about why would you invest in the BRICS when Brazil and Russia are likely to grow slower than the United States this year? Why would you invest there? A lot of people are wondering about that. It's going to challenge them. Why would you invest in Turkey when rule of law is being systematically abrogated, where institutions that have been built up and consolidated over decades of candidate membership in the EU are now being dismantled piece by piece through massive infighting between the prime minister and members of his own party, as well as secularists outside his party? Why would you invest in those countries? A lot of people are asking that. Turkey should be performing well. Great demographics, key location geographically, crossroads of everything, great for infrastructure, right? Smart folks, well-educated, women play a good role in society, pretty urbanized, financial sector works, the economy, they got industrialists who have invested in their own country and they keep the money there, the Kochs, the Sabanjis, the Dawans. Economically, you want to talk about a machine that's been built. This is a machine that's been built. And yet the politics in Turkey, pardon my French, are a freaking disaster. And so as a consequence, we're not so excited about Turkey over the next couple of years. Turkey's not an emerging market right now. It's a submerging market. They can turn it around, no time soon, but they can. So emerging markets this year, how is geopolitics impacting the markets? In the emerging market space, pretty badly, right? And it doesn't mean you don't invest in emerging markets. This is not a contagion because it's not coming structurally. It's coming from the paucity of governance in the countries themselves. There are some emerging markets doing very well in this environment that are governed better. Colombia, coming out of elections, will do well. Mexico, which came out of elections, doing astonishingly well. Malaysia, after elections, improved governance. A lot of sub-Saharan Africa, from a low base, places like Kenya doing pretty well. We can pick emerging markets. We can cherry pick. But across the board, generally speaking, most are doing more poorly than others. It's a geopolitical issue, right? We haven't gotten to this part of the world yet. So let's talk about this. So yesterday we had this great meeting opened by President Park, who was talking about how we need to focus on reunification. I agree. I wrote this book, The J-Curve, back in 2006. I talked about the relationship between openness and stability. And one of the most interesting takeaways of the book is that some countries are open, some countries are stable because they're open, right? Consolidated democracies tend to be stable because they're open. New Zealand, Australia, the United States, France. I mean, the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? Nobody asks me about that anymore. Why not? Because no one cares. Is that because poor people don't deserve a voice in the United States? No. It's because this is not a pressing issue. Why? Because America's really stable. The United States had an election between Bush and Gore. 50% of the population believed that the election was stolen. Ultimately, you had the Supreme Court in a partisan vote, judges aren't supposed to do that, deciding who was going to win the election. A complete abrogation of the judicial process in the United States. Nobody even talks about this anymore. There were no riots in the street. There was no downgrade of American credit. I had people, friends of mine, call me from Russia, from Indonesia, from other countries. They said, how dare you hypocrites, you Americans, you talk about democracy. Look at your own system. I said, you don't understand. It's precisely because we can have a disaster of this scale that doesn't matter. You try doing that in your country, people are going to explode. Why? Because your institutions aren't consolidated. I mean, I'm not saying we're not hypocrites. We are hypocrites. But we can afford to be hypocrites. The point is we can increasingly not afford to be hypocrites from a foreign policy perspective. We can afford to be hypocrites domestically. Why? Because there's so much stability. We can say we're going to improve the minimum wage. No, we're not. Why not? Because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter enough to make anyone do anything about it. This year, Congress is going to do pretty much nothing. In fact, you've had less legislation passed in this Congress than any Congress since they've started taking records of how much legislation Congress has passed. Still does a lot more than the Indian Parliament, for example, but in the United States, this is pretty bad. The question is, does it matter for investors that want to invest in the U.S.? The answer is no. Investors just want to make sure they don't screw things up. If they do nothing, that's actually okay, right? With the exception for a very brief period of time after the 2008 financial crisis when it required a bailout from Washington. For a very brief flicker of time, the United States looked like an emerging market. And then as soon as they cut those checks and they got the banks working again, boom. By the time S&P downgraded because they were concerned the United States might not make good on their debt, all that showed me, S&P doesn't hire political scientists either. That's all it showed me. Oh, I was loud about that one. I'm like, come on, guys, really? Really? You really believe this? That's ridiculous. So anyway, it has to do a lot with stability. So she was talking about the fact that reunification, something the South Koreans now need to talk about. Point is, you've got a lot of countries that are stable because they are consolidated. They're stable because they're open. You have other countries that are stable because they're closed. That is the left side of the J. From your perspective, this side of the J. Sorry, I've got a little dyslexia when I present backwards. The point is that the very, very top left-hand corner of the J, the steep part, right at the end, there's one country that sits there. Right? Run by a little young dictator, Kim Jong-un, right? North Korea. There are not many totalitarian states left in the world today because it is harder to stay at the top left-hand corner of the J when it's easy to get information into societies. It's easy to let people in those societies realize that their government is abysmal, right? The North Korean government is abysmal, right? It's horrifying. The depredations that are being forced upon the North Korean citizens are some of the worst in the world. This is not a regime that is likely to stay in place for long. I do not know. I mean, President Bush was there yesterday and they asked him, the moderator asked him, how long do you think before reunification? He said, I think it's going to be a very long time. I think that's right if you ask how long before the South Koreans and the North Koreans can get together and agree on a reunification process. If you ask me how long before North Korea implodes and South Korea suddenly has to deal with reunification, that could be 10 years. That could be 10 days. Could be. You guys ready for that? Asia's not ready. Asia's not ready. Jim Rogers, you guys know Jim Rogers? So Jim Rogers was there yesterday, bow tie, wearing American, lives in Singapore, says he's going to put all of his money into North Korea going forward. He's wearing suspenders that have dollar bills on them. I swear to God he is. He is the antithesis of everything I stand for, apparently, as a political scientist. He's on the panel with me. We're having this great little fight because he's saying, I'm invested in North Korea. The economics are extraordinary. Everyone's going to work. Everyone's going to invest. It won't cost taxpayers any money. It's all going to be done by Samsung. God bless America. That's what he said. I swear to God, he's like, this is extraordinary. I'm like, wow. He said, you guys can't go to North Korea, but I can go to North Korea. I can get a bicycle. I can do a bicycle tour. He's like, I was thinking, wow, maybe I should go to North Korea. What's high season? Are there 5-star hotels? How's the food? I had no idea, At the end, he's telling South Korea, you know what you guys need to do? You need to get a basketball team, then everything will be fine. I swear to God, he said this. He did. I'm getting all riled up. So anyway, I then said, I agree with Jim that if we get to reunification, that the ability of a combined Korea to be a driver for growth in Asia is one of the most exciting stories in the world. It's like Iran. If you can open Iran and you can get rid of the mullahs, 85 million people, educated women, urbanized, diversified economy, civil society, 25% of Iranians with university degrees live in developed countries. Wow, I love that. If. The only thing Jim forgot was the if. The problem is that the if in North Korea is not a little if. It's like a big if. It's in capital letters, flashing lights, and there are lots of things around that if. One of the ifs is, how does North Korea get to the point that they get open? He said, don't worry about integration because you're all family. You speak the same language. You know what I say to that? I see how North Korea treats their family. You don't want that, right? This is a dangerous situation. These people could die very easily when this firm goes down. They know that. When this country goes down, they know it. And so as a consequence, the potential that the most highly militarized society in the world suddenly implodes. What's the disposition of their nuclear weapons? What's the nature of the military? How worried are they? You're right there. That could be a great opportunity for you. It could actually crush you guys. Could lead to a lot of people dying. We need to worry about that. We have to have that conversation openly. What are you going to do? How do you respond, right? But there's another problem. I'm delighted you're starting to have the conversation domestically. But you also need to have the conversation internationally. And here's the big problem, is that South Koreans, the Japanese, and the Chinese basically kind of hate each other right now, right? It's mostly a China-Japan problem. But it's a significant South Korea-Japan problem too. Okay, when North Korea implodes, and it's probably more likely a when than an if, just on the basis of historical totalitarian regimes, it's more likely. Revolutions are happening faster. They get started faster. They're hard to end, but they're easier to start with technology. They're easier to start with information, easier to implode. So let's assume that it's a when North Korea implodes. And the Chinese, the South Koreans, the Americans, and the Japanese are all saying, wow, this is a huge crisis, and we don't trust those other guys. So we're all on highest military alert. We have very different preferences for what we want out of Korea after North Korea implodes, what we want on the idea of nuclear weapons, what we want in terms of the economy of this region, and we mistrust each other completely. The South Koreans have to start coming up with mechanisms. You have to do it, because you care about this more than anyone else. It's like Russia has to do something on Ukraine because they care more than anyone else. North Korea matters more to you than anyone else. So therefore, it is incumbent on South Korea to ensure that in the event of implosion, that you have the ability to work with the Japanese, the Americans, the Chinese, to come to mutual understanding and how to respond and resolve this. That means you need to start scenario planning with them now, which is really hard to do if you don't talk to the Japanese. So it's actually, given the level of opportunity and risk around North Korea, it is incumbent on the South Korean government as a matter of highest national policy priority to ensure that you have operative, relative, working on trusted relations with the other key powers for whom North Korea is a critical issue. Because if you don't get that, the likelihood that you will never get past the if to take Jim Rogers' tour of the North goes up very significantly, right? Now, unfortunately, that is harder for you to do given the nature of Japan-China right now. Japan, yes, but also China, both, and the US, frankly. So let me, before I take questions, let me go through that briefly. Let's start with the US. The United States, actually I'll end with the US. Better to end with the US. Start with Japan. So, Abe is clearly the strongest prime minister that Japan has had in decades. If you went to Davos this year, they're talking about two people, Rouhani and Abe. He's almost a Clintonian figure. He's charismatic. He speaks very fluently, very elegantly. He's pretty tall. He's chummy. He puts his hand on your shoulder when he talks to you. He's trying to build the economy, and he hates China, right? And it's personal. I mean, when you talk to Abe about China, you can actually see, right? You can talk about anything. And I've got a pretty good relationship with him. But you can actually see muscles twitch, right? He does not trust these guys. He knows that they are a problem for him in a serious way. And I think he also firmly believes that the Constitution, the Japanese Constitution, the lack of an effective military, the lack of an effective intelligence organization, the lack of an NSA, he believes that these things are fundamentally dangerous. They undermine Japan's national interest and security, especially because of how China is growing and how much China is spending on the military and what they're doing in the East China Sea and all the rest. Now, Abe also has problems in the sense that, given his own history, his family's history, the strength of his emotional attachment to going to the Yasukuni War Shrine, to talking about history in ways that will be confrontational to the South Koreans and the Chinese, makes it harder to work with him. That is a challenge. You aren't going to change that. That's just a reality. The Americans don't like that either. But you got to be aware of it, right? The Chinese are very happy to demonize Japan. They see Japan in a very simplistic way. The anti-Japanese sentiment in China is incredibly high. Only 6% of Chinese have a positive attitude towards Japan, right? As opposed to like 30% of South Koreans, right? What's interesting, the Japanese really don't like the Chinese or the South Koreans either. But what the Chinese don't seem to get is that not only is Abe a strong prime minister, but aside from South Korea and China, Japan's soft power in Asia is much stronger than China's. The Indonesians like the Japanese. They don't like the Chinese particularly, right? The Philippines, Australia, India. Abe makes all these trips with the CEOs. America has stopped pivoting to Asia. Japan is now pivoting to Asia. And Japan is not just going to talk about economic relations, they're going to talk about alliances. And the Chinese are going to hate this. And this is going to cause serious confrontation between Japan and China, right? So let me now get to the United States, which is that the United States was focused on the pivot. The unfortunate thing is that all of the people that were focused on Asia in the first Obama administration are gone. Every single one of them. Tim Geithner, gone. Jack Lew, not a bad guy, doesn't do global, doesn't do Asia. Geithner speaks Mandarin, used to live in Japan, right? Tom Donilon, big focus on China. Susan Rice, I don't think so. Hillary Clinton, Asian pivot, economic statecraft, most important thing to focus on. John Kerry, Israel-Palestine. How about that? 11 trips so far. Going to be 12 shortly. Okay, you can do that. Don't know why. You can do it, right? Kurt Campbell, who was the architect of the pivot, gone. Who's doing Asia from a senior level in the administration right now? Not a priority. You guys listened to the Obama State of the Union when he talked about foreign policy? Did not mention Asia. That's astonishing to me. Did not mention it. I was at the 50th annual Munich Security Conference watching Secretary of State Kerry give a talk. Didn't mention Asia. Really? Right? Nope. Not their priority, not what they do. So the fact is that it would be really good if instead of Israel-Palestine, where the Israelis don't want a deal and the Palestinians completely mistrust the Americans, in Japan and South Korea, where you have two allies of the United States that both do have a good working relationship with the U.S., how about if Kerry tried to help fix that? I think that would be smart. They have shown no interest in that. If I were President Park, when Obama comes to Japan and South Korea in April, I would make this a priority. I would say we could really use your help on this relationship. We're particularly worried about what's going to happen with North Korea if suddenly it implodes and the South Koreans and the Japanese, your two best allies, can't talk to each other. That's bad for all of us. Let's make sure that we can work together, at least to start on that issue, where we know we have a common interest in stability in the region, right? How about a try? So that's my view. That's where I think we need to get. A little personal, but since you invited me here to your homes, here I am. No, I applaud the South Korean government that they are willing to invite me in a global stage yesterday after President Bush to talk completely openly about this issue. The Chinese would not invite me to speak openly. They would tell me what I would talk about. And I don't do well with that. Right? I mean, the fact is, before I came in, they didn't say, no, don't criticize the South Korean government. This is a no-go area. Anything you want. That's a great start. That's a great start for a country that has major historical issues with the Japanese. And I think you can build on that. The great thing about South Korea is you, as a country, are resilient. For the last 50 years, we've been talking about growth. Because if you focus on economics and economic models, you focus on growth. Who's growing? The emerging markets are growing. China, 10% a year, growing. The United States, 4%, growing, no problem. In the G0, in a world where politics is driving market outcomes to a greater degree, you focus less on growth. You focus on resilience. You know, the Japanese have nothing to teach us about growth. Nothing. Last 30 years, they don't grow. But they're resilient. They can teach the world about resilience. You see how they responded to Fukushima? I don't just mean the government. How about the people? How about nationwide, almost 100% compliance in massive energy use reduction so that the country could more effectively deal with the shutdown of the nuclear plants? Who else could do that? Could China do that? You've got to be kidding me. Philippines? Indonesia? How about the United States? Not so resilient. The Japanese are world-class at resilience. The South Koreans are world-class at resilience. That's a big deal. And it's a particularly big deal given what is facing you just a few miles to your north. But the message, the final message I wanted to deliver is as resilient as you are domestically, you are not resilient from a regional perspective. Not at all. And you need to fix that. And you're right, the Japanese need to fix it too. The Americans need to fix it too. It's fair if the Japanese do as much work as you do to try to fix it. But you know what? The world is not fair. And the reason why you have to do more is because you care more. Because if North Korea implodes, when North Korea implodes, you're the people with the stuff to worry about, not the Japanese. You are. So if you don't fix this, it is your problem. And in a world where it's every nation for itself, the countries for whom things matter the most are obliged to actually do the lifting. No one else does it for you. So that's the message. I don't know. I don't write speeches before I show up. I just kind of see where I go. That should be obvious to everybody here. I hope you appreciate. I hope you enjoyed sitting around for an hour. I know we have some time for Q&A now. Do we have roving microphones as well? Is that true? Look at this, everybody. Beautiful
we have
room.
a
Thank
few
you very
microphones.
much, guys.
Thank you. Round of applause for Dr. Bremmer. So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Dr. Bremmer, there's also an interpretation device on the podium. So for those who feel more comfortable in Korean, you can also ask questions in Korean or in English. Please, when you do ask a question, please identify yourself, your name and where you're affiliated. If you have any questions, you could just go ahead and raise your hand. We'll take a few at a time. Question in the middle.
Hello, Dr. Bremmer. Yejin. I'm a fellow political scientist, very proud to say that. I work at the China-Korea-Japan Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat. I'm trying to get the three countries to hate each other a little bit less. It's really hard. So my question, I think nobody would disagree with you that the Korea needs to work with key regional partners on solving the nuclear and the North Korean issue in general. So given the current geopolitical climate, what practical initiatives can South Korea take in terms of working with these regional partners? Thank you.
Any more questions right here?
Thank you, Dr. Bremmer. I'm Leif Eric Easley. I'm a professor of international relations and political economics at Ewha Women's University and a research fellow here at the Asan Institute. I was wondering if you could provide us your thoughts on how markets price in and companies hedge against the uncertainties attached to Korea-Japan historical issues. I recently came back from Tokyo and heard from interlocutors there that some big Japanese banks might not be as willing to help finance Korean companies opening up or expanding operations in third countries, and that some Japanese companies are concerned about diversifying away from South Korea because they see these court cases coming up with the unresolved issues of historical compensation during unpaid wages during wartime. And I wonder if you've done some analysis of the political risks associated with those historical issues. Thank you.
At least one more, and then he go take those. One in the middle.
Good morning. My name is Max Nurnes. I'm a graduate student in international relations at Seoul National University. I study political science, you're a political scientist, and you're in the risk business. A lot of political scientists always face the claim that political science is not able to predict events, and two of the more famous examples are the end of the Cold War and the Arab Spring. How does this work for you? Do you think political science can actually predict events? Because the practical record is rather bad, arguably.
Good, great question. Good questions. I like the last one the most because it's kind of out of the box, but let me deal with the first two. The practical initiatives. One practical initiative I can think of, back in the 90s, John McLaughlin, who at the time I guess was the deputy head of the CIA, started a practice of red teaming, where the Americans would put together teams, fairly unconventional teams, that were not, usually the United States, you'd come up with policy ideas, internal policy ideas, and then they'd get shot down by people that were meant to be devil's advocates. And so in other words, you just take the opposite side. And that's the way it was always done. Well, for the first time, the intelligence department, CIA, decided they were going to put groups together for particularly intractable problems, and they were going to have another team that wasn't meant to be a devil's advocate. It was meant to try to get inside the head, the cultural context of the other actor that was opposed to the United States, which might be in some ways aligned to what the U.S. wanted, in some cases wouldn't be. And really to try to say, okay, given that, what do we want? How would we respond to U.S. policy? Where are we trying to go? It's been incredibly successful. And the only problem has been trying to find the right people inside the U.S. government to do that. I suggested that the U.S. should hire Canadians, right? Because it would work better. He laughed when I said that. It was pretty good. So you now have a situation where the Chinese, the Americans, the South Koreans, the Japanese are all really worried about what the hell is happening in North Korea. Together, we should come up with the idea of doing a mutual red team on what is going to happen within North Korea, given stresses. That would be a great thing to have these countries work on together, right? And limit it to that. Don't try to fix anything else. Whenever you try to fix other things, life gets hard. You focus on one little thing. This is why Rodman was successful, right? By the way, I think Rodman is crazy as well, right? But I'm not angry that he's going to North Korea. I'm delighted he's going to North Korea, right? I asked a friend of mine who is in the intelligence agency, I said, what do you think the likelihood is that Rodman is actually working with the intelligence agencies in the U.S. when he comes back and actively debriefing? And you know what he said to me? He said, are you asking me what the percentage is that he knows he's doing it? Because it's 100% that he's doing it, right? That they have somebody who is actually getting information that's a friend of Rodman. The only question is, does he know he's doing it? Rodman just went and brought a whole bunch of people that had never been to North Korea before, including, interestingly, a Columbia professor of neurology. How come that guy went? I've been meaning to look into this. It was only a few weeks ago. Because the U.S. intelligence agencies actually have a group that actually study the way people look, and as a consequence try to understand if they have neurological disorders or psychological disorders. They put an enormous amount of time into that. I really would like to know if that guy that went to North Korea is in any way connected to those programs, because we could learn something. And frankly, that's information that I think we should be sharing with the South Koreans, the Chinese, and the Japanese. But you can't do it without trust, which we don't have it right now, right? Anything we could do, any information that we have on North Korea, this is the single most important thing we should be working on. It's the one thing that's most likely to lead to armed conflict between our countries. Of anything out there, sudden implosion of North Korea, we should work on that. I think that's like a no-brainer, right? But we don't have time for stuff like that, because it may be a no-brainer, but it's not urgent until it is. I hate things in policy that aren't urgent until they are. They're really hard to deal with. Question on how to price risk on China, on South Korea, Japan. My answer would have been very different if you had said China, Japan, but South Korea, Japan, the answer is not very much. I don't think they worry about it much. Frankly, we have about 40 clients in Japan. They're mostly at the CEO level, though. I mean, we work with the whole company, but I work with CEOs directly, so I talk to them all the time. Recently, China has come up a lot in, should we take expats out? Should we have a plan if there are demonstrations? Should we be investing less? The China Plus One investment strategy, driven by JBIC and then JICA, JETRO, those organizations, that's almost 10 years old now, I think. They don't really have that for Korea. So you may be right that there are a few banks at the working level that are thinking about this. At the CEO level, I have not fielded one question on, do we need to diversify from South Korea? Not one. And by the way, even on the China front, you've got a lot of Japanese at the working level saying, yeah, we've got problems, but locally, my partners are pretty good and I can still make a buck over there. So not so much. So then the question, hat guy, about can we predict? I don't like to predict, but I don't think we need to predict. I think the purpose of political science assessing political risk is not to say, here is what's going to happen among unknown outcomes. It's actually to say, given the political actors and their preferences, here is what is politically possible, the range of what's politically possible. See, without that, you have, I don't believe that our call that the Eurozone was not going to fall apart was a prediction. I think it was about, the economists said, well, the economies don't work. Then as a political scientist, I was saying, okay, tell me what the mechanism is by which a country will either leave or the Germans or the ECB will force the Greeks out. Tell me what the mechanism is. And you realize that there was not an effective political mechanism. It was not going to happen. It wasn't that you were predicting something. It was that the political factors simply limited the range of what was possible. Didn't mean that you knew how much money was going to be given by the Germans or the ECB and when. Didn't mean you knew the conditions, but you understood. That was important. Another thing that we do, and especially if you think about how many things are said by actors in the political space that are purely ideological. So the Americans tell the Russians, don't go in or else. Now, I don't know exactly what the Americans are going to do, but I know, given the Europeans and the Americans' different views on Russia, there is no possibility to get the Germans or the Italians on board for significant sanctions. And next to no, and negative possibility, if that were possible, of the Germans and the Italians supporting military engagement. So we don't know exactly what the Americans will do, but we know that everything they're talking about is ineffectual from the Russian perspective. So we strip out the ideology and we just look at the range of what's political possible. One final thing we do, which is important, and this is that we don't know when shocks will happen. I did not know that a Tunisian fruit merchant would set himself on fire and that would lead to the country to rip into social dissent. I had no idea that that fruit merchant would be harassed by the police on that day and he would decide to come back and set himself on fire and the whole country would notice and they would explode. I didn't know that. I missed that. I just missed it. Shame on me, right? Poor guy. That's not funny. I mean, it is, but it's not at a more structural level. The point is, what we do as political scientists is not try to predict shocks, it's try to understand resilience to shocks, political stability. The same month that the Tunisian guy set himself on fire, there was someone setting themselves on fire for some political reason in Texas. I don't think it even made New York newspapers. And it's not because they set themselves on fire every day in Texas, at least I don't think so, but it's because we're resilient. So it really behooves us, given that shocks are likely to hit all over the world, as political scientists understanding risk, it behooves us to understand who is resilient to what kinds of shocks. If you can do all of those things, you don't need a crystal ball, right? But you do need to be you do need political scientists. We're good at this stuff. It turns out that the stuff that we are trained to do is actually useful. Who knew? And what we need to do is we need to get away from the academic on the one hand. On the other hand, we need to get away from the PhD writing with long sentences, very abstruse, that no one can understand our point. We need to get away from the idea that we can't actually talk about things that are in the news and relevant today. We can only talk about big structural stuff, because the stuff that we talk about, that we're trained to do, about political actors and stability of institutions, bureaucratic theory, all of these things, geopolitics, these things matter. They actually really matter. And it makes a difference for the markets. It makes a difference for corporations. So should we do another round? Do we have time? Yeah, good.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Hans Schadl. I teach political science over at Yonsei University down the street here. I just want to turn the resilience question for a moment over to dictators and thugs. Because a lot of commentary that I read, even this week with Ukraine, basically says, and I know there's competing takes on Putin and how he'll fare through all this, but a lot of the commentary just says he's in the catbird's seat right now. And of course, there's plenty of commentary on that that could apply to the Assad regime in Syria to a certain extent. They're in a different kind of catbird seat, maybe a weaker one, but still, they're there. They've been resilient in a dark sort of way. And after the Human Rights Report came out a few weeks ago about North Korea, again, some of the better commentary on that, Jonathan Friedland, say, from The Guardian, wrote about it. He said, sure, the world will look at this grimly, shake their heads, but nothing will happen. Immediately, that Kim Jong-un, for all his problems, will hang on. That Friedland wrote, it's a good time to be a dictator. Now, as you pointed out, it's easier than ever also for revolutions to topple dictators in the right connected kinds of circumstances, but still, to what extent do you see dictators and thugs in today's world getting the upper hand, and how can the world's constitutional democracies, turn the tide in a sense?
Let me take that right now. That's a good question. I want to address it. It is a very good time to be a dictator internationally. It is a very bad time to be a dictator domestically, right? And so there's two things, right? The G0 makes it easier to be a dictator. A lot of people hate Assad, but not enough, right? Assad is a pretty tin pot dictator. Doesn't have nukes. His army is right? I mean, Gaddafi almost made it. Think about how much had to be done before the United States got rid of this guy, was willing to do it. The French were not willing to go by themselves. The Brits weren't. They could have, but they refused. They had to get the Americans. The Americans didn't want to do it. The Gulf Cooperation Council, the Arab League, who we hadn't heard from in decades, said, please do this stuff, right? And Gaddafi didn't even have an army. He had basically paramilitary units that were paid for from Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa. So, I mean, this was an easy guy to get rid of. The fact that Assad is there for 3 years into this war, killing 150,000 people, means it's a good time to be a dictator internationally. It is a bad time to be a dictator domestically, which is why Kim Jong-un is in rough shape. Now, do I believe that Putin is in trouble as a consequence of that? No, not yet. And the reason for that is because Putin has done a lot of things over the last years to consolidate his rule domestically. So he's in a stronger position vis-a-vis the opposition, and he knows it. His approval ratings are pretty high in Russia. They're about 60%. And yes, Vitsaum is a Russian, basically owned, influenced polling institution, but the Levada Institute is not, and they give you the same numbers. In recent elections, Putin, I think, got under 50% in Moscow, but he crushed it everywhere else. Navalny, the major opposition figure that actually does have a level of popular support among the intelligentsia, kind of a Nemtsov or Yavlinsky type figure, was allowed to run free after a trumped up charges because Putin didn't consider him a threat. Now they've thrown him back in jail for a few months, After the Olympics are over, they let Khodorkovsky go, they let Pussy Riot go. Why? Because they weren't worried. They got a lot of money to throw around. This guy took $15 billion out of the Russian pension fund to give to the Ukrainians. There is no one else in the world that could have done that. There's no one else in the world that would have wanted to do that, right? But he could, because he does have that level of stability. But I do worry, as we think 5 years, 10 years down the road, with energy prices going down, given the energy revolution, I don't know what Russia's going to look like. I worry about Saudi Arabia, but not near term. Why? Because when the Saudis are really getting pressured, you know how you'll know? Because they're going to stop giving money to the Egyptians and the Lebanese and the Syrians. They're still doing that, which means they're not worried domestically. I feel pretty comfortable that they're not in that level of... But when Egypt falls apart, Tunisia falls apart, I blame the Eurozone, actually. Because the ties were all with Europe, right? Remittances. If you're Egyptian or Tunisia, you want to get a job, you go up to Europe, you get a job, you send the money back to Egypt and Tunisia. Eurozone crisis, you don't have that job. Trade comes from Europe. Tourism, European tourists. International aid comes from Europe. Eurozone crisis hits, those guys get crushed. But the demographics continue to grow, so suddenly they can't keep it going. They don't have the money. The Saudi support, the Qatari support doesn't get them where they want to go. And what happens to Mubarak? Poof. Just like that. Now, again, easy to start a revolution, hard to finish a revolution. Easy to agree that we all hate that guy, hard to then get together and say, what do we like? I don't know, right? And now we've got Sisi coming back in Egypt. But I think that's the point, is that the domestic and the international play at two very, very different levels on this front. The J-curve is a domestic argument. The G0 is an international argument. They actually are at cross purposes with each other. That's the answer to the question. Yeah, sure.
So we still have time for about 2 more questions over on this side.
Hello, I am Kwan Song, one of the students in the Asan Academy under Asan Institute. First of all, as an economic major, I very much enjoyed learning about your terminologies such as J-curve or pet-tail or G0. Today I enjoyed hearing about your evaluations of America's reactions on Crimea crisis. And I remember that you have given quite a compliment to Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, or the president of new Soviet Union in the Syrian crisis. So now the media are talking about another Cold War coming. So I want to ask you about your prospects of Putin's policies and what should happen, the effective strategies for the US.
Good question.
And the woman right here, yes.
Thank you. My name is Shukriye Bayar. I'm consular at the Turkish Embassy in Seoul. There's a lot of debate going on in international media recently. Actually, it's been a while. It's not a recent. There have been so many books written about it as well. That it's about the diminishing power of the United States, especially when handling the global conflicts. I've been in this job for about 15 years, and in terms of conflicts, I've seen we are, as far as I could see, we're at one of the worst periods in terms of the global conflicts and the threats they are posing to the world order. Ukraine is the last example of it, but starting with the Arab Spring, Syria got worse, Egypt is going appallingly bad, and on this part of the world, tensions are rising. As you rightly mentioned, the relationship between the countries is not going very well. Nationalism is on the rise, as many thinkers assert. My question is, what is your take on this? I mean, it's obvious that U.S. cannot save the whole world. Whatever Obama administration did so far didn't pay off well to any hands, as far as I could see. And EU is absolutely not a power which can help solve any crisis in any part of the world at the moment, as we see how Ukraine is unfolding. How do you see U.S. power at the moment as a leading country?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same question, but I just wanted to You said that foreign policy was not a priority for Obama, and then you quickly said that it's actually the G0 is structural. So you seem to be saying it's less about Obama himself, or even is it Democrats or Republicans? Or are you saying it's more structural?
Yep, that's a great question. I'm glad you added that. These come together. Let me start with this, because I've been trying to think about this myself. You know, the U.S. is not in decline. I don't believe it. You look at the U.S. dollar, you look at demographics, look at entrepreneurship, look at the energy revolution, the food revolution. The U.S. is not in decline. You look at Davos this year and CEOs all over the world and where they want to make their bets. Overwhelmingly, they believe more in the United States. The U.S. is not in decline. U.S. foreign policy is in decline, in my view. The perception of U.S. power internationally is actually decreasing. The commitment of the United States to allies around the world, the nature of American alliances, the durability of those alliances, the friendliness, the influence the U.S. has in places like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Indonesia and Germany, right, and Brazil is actually taking a significant hit. And even countries like Canada and Britain, where the relationships are just as good as they used to be, but the governments are freaked out because they're really worried that the U.S. isn't going to play the role it used to, right? And believe me, the Russians and Chinese are also making their bets on this. So, you know, why? Why? How much of this is Obama? At most, I think it's 30%. If I had to really look at all the factors. So let me tell you what I think the factors are. Why is the U.S. in foreign policy decline? Because I think there are a few reasons. Let's focus on the Obama stuff first, which is that Obama was elected after a foreign policy hangover. Iraq and Afghanistan. People didn't like W. They got sick of that. They didn't think they got anything out of it. A lot of money spent, a lot of people injured and dead, affecting a lot of communities in the United States. U.S. didn't want to do that stuff. U.S. saying, what does this matter to us anymore? And furthermore, Obama elected as a first-term senator without any foreign policy experience. It wasn't what he wanted to do. It wasn't his inclination. His first-term team, he brought in a bunch of people that had been attached to other folks. Hillary Clinton, attached to Bill Clinton, was an opponent of his. He kept Bob Gates. He kept David Petraeus. He basically said, you guys do foreign policy. I'm going to focus on getting the country out of this mess and then healthcare. Obama's second-term foreign policy team, much weaker. Wanted Susan Rice, didn't get her. John Kerry doesn't have a great relationship with him, doesn't trust him very much. Doesn't have the same personal interconnections that he did with Hillary Clinton. That's a problem, in my view, right? And so I think a weaker team, again, Jack Lew as opposed to Geithner, a weaker team, that's a piece of this, definitely. Then you also look at the fact that there's a bigger gap between rich and poor in the United States. The average American increasingly does not believe that they benefit from U.S.-led globalization. And so you see in the Tea Party, for example, and among some Democrats on the far left, you see a stronger inclination towards isolationism, protectionism, nativism. You see an unwillingness of Congress to support trade promotion authority early days, so TPP doesn't happen in 2013 or even 2014, it's 2015, right? That's a problem. So that's a little more structural. Then you see the energy revolution and the fact that the United States says, why are we doing this stuff in the Middle East? We don't even need that energy. Nigeria don't even need that energy. Why don't the Chinese go take care of that? Why not the Europeans? We don't care as much about the Middle East. And that's even before the energy revolution really gets going. You think we don't care about the Middle East now? We haven't even started to not care about the Middle East. We're going to really not care about them going forward. So that gets a little more structural. But then you've got the big structural pieces. The big structural pieces are you used to have a world with the United States and a few advanced industrial allies. Now you've got a world where the emerging markets are getting much bigger, so there are a lot more countries that matter. Harder to coordinate with a larger number, number one. Number two, the emerging markets matter more, and many of them just disagree with the U.S. They have different values, different priorities, they're poorer, they have different economic systems, different political systems. Harder to align American foreign policy with those countries than it is with the Brits, or the Canadians, or even the French, right? Then you have the fact that the Eurozone America's top allies have been incredibly distracted for the last few years on the Eurozone crisis. And furthermore, coming out of the Eurozone crisis, the most important driver of Europe is Germany. Germany doesn't look at the world geopolitically. They look at the world economically and mostly bilaterally, where the Brits and the French were much more aligned with the US way of looking at the world. So when you put all of these things together, and the fact that if the Eurozone was distracted domestically for the last 4 years, that's nowhere near as distracted as the Chinese will be domestically over the next 10 years, as they start to truly engage in transformational economic reform to move towards being a consumer-driven economy. So, I think the G0 is actually overdetermined. And so the question is, how much of this is Obama? I don't think it's that much. And I didn't even talk about one other thing, right, which is Snowden. Holy cannoli, right? I mean, here you have a situation where America says, after 10 years of fighting the war on terror, that actually terror is no longer the biggest threat to U.S. national security. Actually, the biggest threat is cyber attacks on the U.S. And right after they say that, suddenly Snowden makes it impossible to talk about that issue anymore. Everyone involved in cyber is fighting a rearguard action just to continue to justify their existence. The biggest enemy of the NSA is no longer China. Apparently it's Congress, right? That's really hard. It still is China, of course, but they can't focus on it, certainly not publicly, which helps the Chinese. But you put all of this together, and then you add some bad luck on Syria, right, where the Americans ended up with the policy they wanted, but Obama, intemperate, said red line, chemical weapons, and got stuck at every level, got stuck with the red lines, like, they won't put me in a corner. They won't put me in a corner. I can get out of the corner. Uh-oh, I'm in a corner. I'm in a corner. Maybe the Russians will help me. Which the same thing happened on Ukraine. The only problem on Ukraine is once he's in the corner, the Russians aren't going to help him, right? Because the Russians are a real problem on Ukraine. So I think that's really the answer. And what's going to happen? You say, well, what are we going to do if the U.S. is in foreign policy decline? Who's going to do it? The Chinese going to do it? No, they are not. The Indians going to do it? You know what? India has like 1.3 billion people. New Zealand has 4 million people. They have the same number of diplomats. Are you kidding me? You want Indian help. How about New Zealand help? That'll be great, right? Nobody cares about New Zealand, but they got diplomats apparently. Well, are you from New Zealand? No, you're not from New Zealand. Why are you even laughing at that? I'm remotely from New Zealand. Like, I'm Korean. No, I just think that's funny. I don't like people from New Zealand. There's only 4 million of them, it's safer to pick on countries that are really small because they're rarely in any people from New Zealand? See? None. We don't care, right? We don't care. Don't care about New Zealand. If it's not, who's going to do it? And the answer is, again, smaller, regional, but the countries that are starting to play a bigger foreign policy role, who? Germany, Japan. Now, Germany, that's potentially a good thing. On Ukraine, Germany might be the answer. Merkel, they speak in German, Merkel and Putin together. The relationship of trust is more there. Her ability, fact-finding commission in Crimea, hold elections in Crimea for autonomy, have the Russians accept that. They don't have to take their troops out. Have the Ukrainians accept it. Have the Russians say they won't go beyond Crimea. Give the IMF money to the Ukrainian government. Make the Ukrainian government accept the rights of ethnic minorities across Ukraine, including the Russians. Rehabilitate Russian as a second language in Ukraine. I can see a deal that Merkel could get done. It's not likely, but it's the only hope we have. Because the Russians go into Southeast Ukraine, we have war, right? And that's ugly. Because then we're disrupting energy flows, then Ukraine is screwed as a market, then people are dying. Crimea, Ukraine is like, we're not fighting, these people all hate us, we're not fighting, right? Southeast Ukraine, they're fighting. They're absolutely fighting. But in Japan becoming a more normalized country, suddenly China's like, no, you can't build a military. Not until we've built enough of a military that we don't care if you build a military. Then you can build one that we don't care, right? So that leads me to, who was the other question? Your other question. So that leads me to your question. So you asked about Russia, and you asked about whether the Cold War is coming. Let me tell you something about Russia that relates to the United States. Russia's in decline. Russia's in decline. I was with David Miliband the other day. We had a debate in New York, in front of a few hundred people. I love David Miliband. He's a great guy, very smart guy, former Foreign Secretary of Britain. And he said that somebody asked why the Brits and the Russians have such a bad relationship. This is before the Ukraine scandal, crisis. And he said, it's because the Russians think that we're in decline. We think the Russians are in decline, and we're both right. Now, the interest of the United States in Russia is for the Russians to be in gradual long-term decline and for the Russians not to really notice. Right? Which, by the way, is exactly China's interest towards the United States. Right? Exactly China's. And by the way, China's doing a better job of this than the Americans are. And that's the problem. Right? Is this a new Cold War? Again, you know who Russia's allies are right now? Nobody. The Russians have been losing consistently for 20 years. They've been losing consistently since 1988. Really? You could argue they've been losing consistently since Khrushchev, right? Maybe since the Soviet Union was started. Maybe hundreds of years. But they've certainly been losing for the last couple of decades. The Soviet Union is gone. Eastern Europe is gone. Suddenly, Georgia lost. You know, all they could do is keep a rump, you know, sort of Ossetia. And now they're going to lose Ukraine. And the Americans stuffed their face in it. Not acceptable. Not acceptable. Anyone that knew anything about how Russia perceived their national interest knew they were going to do something. The only question was near-term or long-term. Would they wait for elections, get Tymoshenko on board, buy her off like they did before? They'd already overturned one revolution, the Orange Revolution. They're ready to do it again. But I think because of American policy and some European policy, that actually goaded the Russians to go in stronger and harder, especially because Putin clearly felt that the Americans posed no likelihood of retaliating in a significant way. They saw that in Syria. And they probably felt that given that they bailed the Americans out in Syria, heck, the Americans wouldn't be as difficult here. This is not a Cold War, but it is a real hit to American credibility internationally. The sad thing is the Russians aren't doing it to the Americans. On this one, the Americans are doing it to themselves. Need to fix it. But everything I've seen from the Americans over the last couple of days, from Samantha Powers, the UN ambassador, from Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, from John Kerry, Secretary of State, even from Obama, has all been, these are our values: sovereignty, territorial integrity. You got to get out of Crimea. And I got to tell you, the likelihood of them getting out of Crimea is zero. Okay, there's nothing we can give them that's going to get them out of Crimea. So why are we doing this? Just to show that we're going to stick with it when that doesn't work? How do we feel about that? I really think this was not planned. I think that the U.S. was actually doing foreign policy kind of on the fly without a lot of inputs for people that really know this stuff. I think here's a Kerry problem. Kerry's a very smart guy, and Kerry has a lot of experience as Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair, and he knows what he knows. He's really good on Israel-Palestine. He knows a lot about the Middle East. He knows a lot of the European actors. But he's gotten to the point, and senators are like this, that he doesn't want to hear anything from other people. He knows it. So when it's something that involves stuff he doesn't know, he uses his traditional sources who don't help him much. And I think he was probably badly advised as a consequence on Ukraine, didn't really understand it well. This really smacks of an administration that is misplaying it. And usually the administration misplays it. They're more deft at responding quickly when they know they've misplayed it. On Syria, they misplayed it. They realized they misplayed it. They tried to back away. Here, they misplayed it. They kept doubling down when it was obvious. And, okay, maybe obvious to me because I've lived in Ukraine for a while in Russia and I speak the language. But, you know, the United States, like New Zealand, has a lot of diplomats, right? We could have called some Kiwis and figured this out. That's what I would have done. So anyway, on that friendly note, I hope you guys found this worldwide. Thank you so much for inviting me to your institute, and have a great day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bremmer. That concludes today's event. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.